I mean, our relations with China are good, our relations with the US are good, our relations with being being good enough that we've basically a lot of criticism coming from countries like India and other countries that have historically been, or Israel, for example, we're closer to, in the last decade or so, being closer to the US, seeing them as a natural ally.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to have with me Professor Sikander Shah. Sikander Shah is a professor of international law at LUMS University. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Sikander, I wanted to begin by asking you, how severe a threat do we see the Trump administration or recent events really to the foundation of international law and really the global rules-based order?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, some people see this as a breakdown of the international order, but if you look at, I mean, it's generally a very recent order, right? I mean, it's post-Westphalia when you have, nation states coming out of Europe and these rules, both customary and treaty laws developing. But in that particular context, I don't think it's that extraordinary. You've had these international organizations fail earlier as well. The League of Nations is an example. When basically some of these major powers didn't become invested in those organizations, and so if you look at that trajectory, you'll see that the current global order is coming out of World War II, and that's where countries like the victorious powers invested heavily in this order. The Americans, as you know, have the US has effectively disproportionately funded the UN system. And that was their sort of this liberal, multilateral order that they were pushing. And for reasons that we can discuss, they are stepping back. And I don't think that Trump's appearance is an anomaly because, that's coming out of local, conditions, leading to him winning not once, twice. So in a way, this is something which is not extraordinary. Whether this means that this particular order fades away and you have another order, threats to that order has always been there, right? Whether it's coming from non-state actors, whether they're militants or quote unquote terrorists, or whether global corporations, or whether it came from historically from other like religion or other ways in which this order has been impacted, or the order replaced a particular order.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we need to go deeper into this to understand where we are. But naturally, we're going through a shift at this point in time.
Absolutely. Sikander, I know you study China and especially its legal perspectives on a number of issues. Do we feel that the traditional underwriters of the global rules-based order, as we've seen it after the Second World War, the West, Western democracies really, their withdrawal or their abdication of their role, do you feel China stepping in and taking on more of a position in shaping international law?
Sure, and I think we need to be a bit critical of this Western order. We were so comfortable with it being a rule-based order. I mean, there have always been criticism or critiques of this order, from coming within the West, right? You've had different realist approach to international law, this institutionalist approach to international law, this incentive-based approach of rational choice theory. Countries act in their own interests. So, and of course, the criticism of this order coming from, the global South and non-Western countries. So, in that way, if this order is evolving, China does have a very special role, considering that it's a post-colonial state. It's now a very powerful, it's a superpower, and again it might be affected by these the same incentives or the same dynamics of power that led the West to act in certain ways. I mean, we can't discount those reasons there as well. Like China might just act in similar, or at times different also, but also in a similar way as, let's say, countries like the West have done. Mm-hmm. But there is a difference, I think, and the difference is that they are not a colonial, pre-colonial or a metropolitan state that, and again, driven, and we've seen the impact of that kind of colonialism And now you see a form of what others even in the US are saying imperialism coming from the US. So you would expect China to play more, but I think their approach, it's a very I think it's a guarded way of how China is acting right now. I think they know they're nearly there, but they're not there. So I think if they are, their mode of operandi has been more focused on the economic sort of ways of being more influential. But they have a lot of barriers to overcome.
Absolutely.
Because those power structures, those economic, those financial power structures are still driven by the West.
Yeah. Looking at where we've seen particular things, if we come back to the issue of Greenland, right? Mm-hmm. We've seen in Congress there's a law being being pushed by Fine, which is I think it's titled the Greenland Annexation and Statehood Act in the US. Now, I doubt that that's going to fly. I doubt that that's going to get passed anytime soon. But just the mere fact that this regime can make threats like that and can talk about annexing territory of an ally, a NATO ally. What are your views on that?
I mean, it shows that there's also something happening behind the scenes, right? I mean, we see that President Trump acting in making certain statements, assertions, and acting on them at times, and then not acting in maybe like in the context of Palestine. We saw that he talked about even like displacing the population, which is crimes against humanity and definitely, like even genocide. But then he steps back and he says, okay, we will develop this area. And now there's a coalition of powers. And so it shows that it's not what he says and gets away with. I mean, recently he said that, international law is dependent on how I perceive it, my morality, right?
Exactly.
I think in a way it also shows the fragmentation of the West, because you see, the Western NATO powers, particularly West, like France, Germany, and the UK helpless, and at times now even trying to say that they might take a position on this. I think the arguments to occupy Greenland are pretextual; they're not real. The US has bases there. They're Russia and China nowhere there. And in fact, he's engaging with Russia and China more than he is with the numerous Western powers.
His own allies.
Yeah, exactly. So. I personally think that, he's a businessman at a particular level, but we, again, cannot discount the politics of the US, which is even domestic politics of the US, which is very alarming, where you see a form of reaction to President Obama and this, the last decades of, Bill Clinton and President Obama, and this sort of, this classical idea of a liberal order flourishing and prospering. And then you see from within the US a reaction to all of those values. Coming from, I would say the majority Caucasian population, some of them deprived of economic security, and, at least those are the arguments made. And you also have a lot of immigration issues and, and also, views on, those liberal values of, like gender empowerment or, diversity, all are being challenged. So it's not just specific to international law. Whether this is going to create another reaction once this government changes. But I think populism in the US and the Republican Party becoming extremely right-wing in light of it's just the way politics is working in the US.
And isolationist, frankly, because we're seeing, withdrawal from 66 international organizations. Even perhaps there might be a collapse of NATO, given, the Greenland situation. So really, I think that's where the Republican Party seems to be heading, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, they're becoming very extreme. And I don't think that the US was not isolationist earlier as well. I mean, during World Wars earlier they were, and then they kind of take this role to... I mean, that's one reason why the league fails, right? I mean,
that's true.
But the thing is, with them being... You can't live... At this point in time, the global order they're not comfortable with them, but they're not comfortable without them also, because the whole system, the whole economic, monetary system, the financial system, and also the security framework we have in place has been structured by them. And that vacuum can't be, even I think China and all these countries that are invested in the US, they wouldn't want it to completely fail, right away. They want there to be some kind of space where they can fill that vacuum in, right? But I think it is a really, in a way, this could materialize. Think about it. If, like, say, the US goes in and basically occupies Greenland and then says, well, and then there's going to be some discussion about it. But I think it'll happen if the US wants it to happen. What can happen subsequently is maybe some further fragmentation in the West. But I think it's a real, there's a real threat,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I really feel that would be a collapse of NATO because, and maybe, a different form of alliances.
But my question to you would be then, is that really a bad thing that the NATO collapses? Because, again, coming from, someone coming from the global south would argue that at times that organization as well as, Western powers, and they've been shown up to an extent right now, have not been loyal to their own values and the order that they project, right? In a way, this makes this more a realist framework where countries, there are multiple, I would say, centers of power in the global order, and then you have some kind of balance of power, within the global order, which we saw in the Cold War did have the effect of limiting countries to being more less aggressive with the use of force, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you have, you could argue a safer world in some ways, right? It's hard to say at this point in time, but definitely this would be a collapse of the liberal order. That I can,
Absolutely.
Right.
Sikander, I wanted to slightly change the topic. It's roughly the same, but looking at, President Trump announced the new Gaza board that he envisages. Now, this sort of framework has been backed by the UN Security Council as well and everything. But it's been rejected by Israel, which is surprising because a lot of the people on that board are very pro-Israel, if you will. And interestingly enough, I think Trump has imposed a $1 billion price tag on states that want to be part of this. Now, you and I don't have $1 billion, so we probably can't be members of it. But I'm sure there are many, Arab
billionaires out there,
billionaire nations out there, certainly that can be part of it. And Pakistan's apparently been invited to be part of this thing. Now, what capacity? I'm not exactly sure, but it's interesting. What are your views on this?
I see the fact that it's problematic, really, because you're corporatizing international law at some level.
Exactly.
And then, you put basically, and I'm not very comfortable with the kind of people who are on that board, like, I think Tony Blair's
he's
on that board. And there's a checkered history when it comes to the war in Iraq. So I don't see these people actually, but I think to an extent why Israel might have a problem is because they might want to have their cake and eat it too, and that's not going to happen now for them, at least, because even if you have others on that board, like the Hakan Fidan, like the Turkish Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and others, so there would be some pushback in terms of how this would unfold, because you're looking at a huge, massive project to construct, and other issues like there's some issues of like how would water be shared between Israel and Palestine, electricity. all of these functions are being performed by certain bodies. Some of those bodies are extremely fragile now, or been I would say effectively destroyed by Israel, like the UN NURVA organization operating there. So I think this is, I find it problematic because I see it kind of imperial also, like, certain powerful nations, Western nations having disproportionate representation on this board, and also the corporate segmentation here, like, how are decisions to be made based on what are going to be the parameters. But I think a lot of Muslim countries have accepted it, and I would, when it comes to Pakistan, I'm concerned more so because I don't think there's any domestic assessments that are being made, and also ownership by our own people. We are a democracy.
There's no real debate on this, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's no public debate. There's no public assessments. How it affects our foreign affairs, foreign relations. We face our own challenges. Both from a lot of them are like challenges from within the neighborhood, like hostile neighbors of India, Afghanistan, and also even countries like Iran and all that are right now in a they are in a active confrontation with those same actors.
Absolutely.
So I would think we should have been more inclusive in our assessments internally before we would make these these kind of. I mean, surely if we've been invited, there's been some interest shown by us, and also there have been public statements to the effect that we want to be part of this initiative.
Absolutely. And Sikander, we're in a place right now where some of the most important issues of our lifetime perhaps require the international community to come together. Look at climate change, look at new forms of weaponry, artificial intelligence, and the regulation needs to take place at the international stage. But we're seeing a fragmentation as we've discussed. What do you see? How do you see the regulation of, say, some of these issues at the international level happening? Are we not going to see international treaties anymore, or are they going to be watered down? What are your views?
That's a very complicated question. I think a lot of this is anyways been driven by these newer sort of challenges or the regulation or the lack of it is now being driven by a lot of big corporations. I mean, AI is effectively controlled in the US by a couple of corporations, and they are driving not just innovation but legal reform, if there is any, and the kind of investment going in these areas,
trillions,
and how that investment is the incentives created through that investment in affecting us and the global order. I don't think any of this, kind of like this invisible hand kind of functioning once those investments are made. I know that in this regard, I was talking to some other experts that China has done a more regulated and more, I would say more diligent and a more structured exercise when it comes to, because they have been also at the forefront of AI development, but their research and their investments are more driven by more thinking going into that sort of initiative. Yes. It's just not like. So, I mean, and hence they're starting from bottoms up in a way because they're kind of moving up. Whereas in the West or in the US particularly, it's kind of like happening at the top and then filtering down. Mm-hmm. So the effects of AI on how it affects global economy, on how it affects security, all of those things are still it's uncharted. But I think I would be more comfortable with countries that are doing their due diligence when it comes to that. But to answer your question, whether when you have corporations driving AI development, and we'll talk about environment in a second. I was at a conference in Warsaw a couple of years ago, and it was sort of sponsored by the West on digital rights and digital freedoms. Absolutely. And it was completely boycotted by these big organizations because they didn't want even the kind of liberal regulation, which is very limited, because it was driven by the West on their activities. Wow. So, I mean, and they're, huge companies that we all know of. Mm-hmm. So I think when it comes to climate, I mean, there's a lot of research to suggest in any case that, I think there's been a global failure when it comes to the environment and how the US kind of pulls out of this whole framework. But again, I think China is playing a bigger role in this. But the problem with the environment, again, is that, having talked to some experts, the human lacks the ability to think beyond a certain amount of generations. Yeah. When it comes to, they don't discount the value of loss subsequently following. So that's always going to be a harder topic. But I mean, I don't know really. I think that President Trump, if the U.S. government changes, in the coming elections, then you might have a huge rebound, and then a lot of these actors might come back and could be kind of like we have with the environment. If you look at certain environmental engagements or treaties, you see that when bigger countries haven't stepped up, so smaller countries do, or mid-sized countries do, or the global south does, and eventually they kind of join in. But other times they don't. So it's hard to say how this will unfold. Yeah. But in the end, I don't see that the multilateral order in the next 4 or 5 years doing well. Okay. You might have still treaties, you might have agreements, but there might be more in the nature of a few countries coming together to look out for their own
regional
arrangements. Right.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you more about middle powers like Pakistan. How do we navigate this fragmented new world that we're seeing right now?
Well, I mean, some people would say that we're doing a good job. I mean, because look at Pakistan, with bigger country but smaller economy. At least the economy, which is the documented economy, right? But I mean, our relations with China are good. Our relations with the US are good. Our relations with being being good enough that we've basically a lot of criticism coming from countries like India and other countries that have historically been, or Israel, for example, we're closer in the last decade or so, being closer to the US, seeing them as a natural ally. So, I mean, you could say that as far as Pakistan, but the problem with that approach is that it kind of puts Pakistan in this role of always trying to maneuver global politics, right?
Yeah.
And I think from our perspective, something that I firmly believe, that a rule-based order based on our size and our concerns, the incentives for us should be to promote this order, because we face a bigger enemy, as we perceive traditionally. And as a consequence, whether it's still better to have that order than to not have that order.
Absolutely.
Whether it's on issues like, all our threats are from outside, in a sense that we don't aggressively use force. Till recently, with our neighbors, we were always kind of like responding. I mean, they have arguments. So whether it's Afghanistan or whether it's India. So for us, and we want to like protect our own border. That's like external sovereignty, I think it affects. But also all like being a low riparian state when it comes to Indus water, climate. These are all issues that puts us in a position where we would want a global multilateral rule-based order to prosper. Considering climate is one example, we can't independently deal with climate.
That's
a lot of the climate disasters we are facing are because we're one of the most climatically affected country out there. Also, when it comes to public health, again, these are things that can't be sorted out by ourselves, right? We need a global system to be plugged into that global system, whether it's polio, whether it's infectious diseases, whether it's
the next COVID.
Exactly, all those things. And it's we also are a younger population. So as a younger population, we should be, we should look forward to the future, because we have an average age of less than 21, I think. So in a country which is going to grow and become big, I think they want to promote a global order, because that order would be good for not just the country, but for the people. And sometimes people who are migrating, or who are who are basically immigrating because of the kind of the what do you say, the money they send back, really, right? I mean, the remittances. We want to promote an order where we as a country are part of the system, we grow, because currently we rank really low when it comes to you must have seen passport rankings and all, because of all those reasons, that it's very hard for Pakistanis to travel outside the country. And we do have a lot of potential when it comes to labor, and even specialized labor like doctors, engineers. And so I think it makes sense for us to be part of these arrangements. So we should promote those arrangements.
Absolutely. And final question, just before I let you go, what do you think are the key areas of growth for international law? Where do you think the few avenues that you foresee?
I mean, it depends, really. It depends on what way. I mean, it depends on the question would be what is going to happen, or what is good for us as a country in the global south.
Well, maybe
right?
both. So whatever your take is on that.
I think also it's important to look at the kind of challenges to international law. One thing is, the example I can come up with is that of like what happened in Venezuela, where you have the US going in, bringing in about regime change in a second, and then going back, and then there's a lot of oil reserves in Venezuela, and there's even from within the US there's a discussion of this being a form of imperialism, that ownership of natural resources, whereas the US didn't do that in Iran, for example. And I'll answer your question, but I want to give you some context here. And basically you have Yeah, I mean, at least the experts are discussing this because Iran started off, it's an ideological state. And as a consequence, removing one or two people is not going to remove the system, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, irrespective, and I don't have an opinion on whether, the state of Iran has, there's a lot of talk of human rights violations and suppression of political rights, but they face genuine sovereignty challenges, is that shows that they did have a system in place where institutions matter, right? So, so coming back to your point, I think where international law can be strengthened is where you have international institutions be more, robust, but also more inclusive, right?
Okay,
I mean, so you're looking at maybe as you're pointing out China playing that role, or the global south playing a role that we haven't, like we need, or even Islamic countries coming together and empowering their own institutions or certain institutions. They could empower their own institutions as well, because in this whole Israel-Palestine war, you could see that the OIC has really not been a powerful organization, even though looking in terms of population, in terms of resources, military might, they're a pretty powerful bloc, right?
Absolutely.
And so I think it's important that we develop institutions, whether we're looking at local institutions before in regional institutions to international institutions, and we, because otherwise it's basically self-interest, and even that in a way develops its own framework, right? If your country is self-interested, it realizes that it's in their own self-interest to obey international law. The US again will, in the larger context, in the larger scheme of things, this is part of some kind of a reaction to what the global order, and from within the US because of domestic politics, right?
Yeah.
How globalization, or even though they are the ones driving it, has affected certain stakeholders within the US, right? But in a way, it could be a natural trajectory. And I think if you look at international, I mean, some people, there's a firm belief in a lot of places, particularly Pakistan, like mid-sized countries, that there is international law can only and always will be explained by the realist approach. Like might is right. But I mean, again, there are alternatives like this institutional order, like, you have organizations like the WHO and like, how AIDS was dealt with, for example, through the UN framework, where basically it's been eradicated, is that institutions, when they are strengthened, do work, right? Maybe they have to be more inclusive. Maybe other countries that haven't been part of those institutions, even in the UN context, this is a concern of inclusivity. I mean, the UN Security Council is not inclusive.
At all, no, absolutely.
So I think that even a Hobbesian way of looking at this is that when you have, if your own interests, you're always at war, you kind of come together. And a lot of Western scholars have said that you need to respect international organizations. On the other, for example, Kant talks about this and says, irrespective of whether you might not, you have your own order and it's a higher order, you still have to respect non-Western orders for things like private international trade. And he's seen as a forefather for, private international trade law, which is not governed by like public international law is, by definition, by a state-based order. So, in any case, there are institutions there, whether they're going to be more public or private. But I think from our perspective, we need to strengthen our own institutions, whether it's SARC, which never got, really going, or whether it's other alternatives like, the BRICS, or, and I think Pakistan needs to be on the right side of history, which they have historically been on a lot of international. I mean, I think at times we made mistakes, but as a whole, we've been a country that has sided on the right side when it came to, these foreign relations and, other kind of, issues on, rights and social rights, legal rights, political rights, rights of people, self-determination. We've always taken the right position. So I think it's important for Pakistan to be on the right side of history, rather than what I'm seeing right now, that they're trying to extract, some kind of short-term benefit.
Sikander, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking out the time.